I realized that my poem would fail that integrity of line test. Any of my poems would. But it's brilliant that it does work with some poems. By the way, your phone's up here, just so you know. So, okay, what I'm going to do is probably not look at all three poems on this handout. Probably just the first and third ones. We'll see what happens with the time. But basically, and I did warn my class, don't come to this talk because you're just going to hear me say the same things I've been saying. So if you're here, too bad. Basically, thanks. Basically, I have this idea that when we think that we, as people, we have many narratives inside us, and many things going on in our lives, apart from how we present ourselves on a day-to-day basis. Someone could be teaching a class, but meanwhile, something sad is happening in their life, or something glorious, whatever. So I think poems, it makes sense that poems would be the same way, given that they're manifestations of what it is to be a person. And thus my interest, and the only thing I know how to do with poems, is to try to figure out how they work and why they're doing that. So I want to look at the distinction between what a poem says, or what it overtly says, and what it seems to also or differently be saying when we look at how it works. So there's what we say and how we say it. And I think that what happens in poems that I find successful, there's a relationship between what is being said and how it's being said. And sometimes it's contradictory, but it's in how it's being said that we get the psychological or emotional narrative of a poem, as opposed to the story, the flat story that's on the page. Or you could say it turns the two-dimensionality of a poem into something three-dimensional by how its structure works. So, as you can tell right now, this is not written down, so I'm just going to see what happens. I trust myself, sort of. Fine, so I'll read this poem by Tom Gunn, The Hug. It was your birthday. We had drunk and dined half of the night with our old friend who'd showed us in the end to a bed I reached in one drunk stride. Already I lay snug and drowsy with the wine, dozed on one side. I dozed, I slept. My sleep broke on a hug, suddenly, from behind, in which the full lengths of our bodies pressed. Your instep to my heel, my shoulder blades against your chest. It was not sex, but I could feel the whole strength of your body set or braced to mine and locking me to you as if we were still 22, when our grand passion had not yet become familial. My quick sleep had deleted all of intervening time and place. I only knew the stay of your secure, firm, dry embrace. Pretty good poet. So, what I often say about poems is they usually aren't about anything overtly interesting. So the straightforward narrative of this poem is simply a couple of people got drunk and ended up in the same bed together, and one woke up in the middle of the night, curled around the other one, and had briefly thought, oh yeah, that's right, we used to kind of be more intimate, and that's the end. So that's not a very interesting narrative in and of itself. That's what I mean about two-dimensional. But there's a reason, it seems to me, there are many reasons to keep going back to it. So one of the things that you'll probably have noticed already is how the rhyme works or doesn't. I think of it as a kind of staggered or off-kilter rhyme. So just looking at the first stanza, we have dined, friend, end, stride, snug, side. Just looking at those, dined seems at the moment not to have much of a real rhyme to it. Friend and end rhyme, obviously. Side and stride do. Snug is just lying around on its own. But as soon as we get to the next stanza, we have it rhyming with hug. And that I find fascinating because I think, okay, so if one of the projects or points of a poem in the beginning is to set up how's this poem going to work, we're told that there's going to be rhyme, maybe, kind of, and it's not going to really be very fixed. When we get to snug and hug, one thing that happens is the two stanzas that are separate are now brought together sonically. Yes? Just making sure you're there. And what I think is, if we think about rhyme as a form of closure, you know how in Shakespeare sonnets the rhyme is every other line, but by the end you have two rhyming lines right next to each other. So there's a progression from separateness to togetherness, which is to say, you could say that rhyme is a form of intimacy, especially when the two rhymes are next to each other, and sonic intimacy, that two sounds become one sound. And if that's true, if rhyme equals intimacy, then you could say that the lack of rhyme equals the lack of intimacy, which I would call estrangement. So, and I think that's part of what estrangement is, too. It's not usually totally having no connection with somebody. There is and isn't a connection. You still relate in some way, but it's not predictable. It's thrown off kilter, just as the rhyme has been throughout here. And as it turns out, there has been, we've noticed in the second stanza, when we have that as if we were still 22, when our grand passion had not yet become familial. It's not as if estrangement hasn't been mentioned, but it's mentioned as a very small memory. So it doesn't seem to be a big part of the poem. And yet the entire poem is consisting of rhymes that enact estrangement. To me, that allows me to read this poem as, on one hand, a narrative about two people who end up in a bed and they used to be together, but that's just in the past, that's just a memory. And it's also a constantly haunting aspect of the relationship. It's constantly haunted by estrangement, just as the poem is. It doesn't say line by line, there's estrangement here. But the lack of rhyme and them finding itself does say there's estrangement, there's something off. First of all, I have to find out if I persuaded you of that much. It's just general, sort of. Okay, because that's my main thing to say about this poem, except that, in addition, well, I do want to say that that kind of use of structure and form, or in this case, rhyme, is what gives to a poem what I think of as muscularity. You see, it begins to have a physical feel to it, as opposed to just being a flat story. And what also contributes to that here, in case we miss that the rhyme scheme is sort of here and there, but I think it would be hard to miss, you can already see, just looking at it, at the level of indentation, that the lines are differently indented, but they do have their match. So lines 1 and 4 and 6 are all flush left, but then line 2 and line 5, no. Line 3 and line 5 are exactly the same indentedness. Line 2 doesn't have a match. It will in the next stanza. So what I'm trying to say is that this sense of things being estranged, of there being a connection that's also about not being connected, exists at the level of sound, at the level of indentation. Also, if we wanted to get into meter, but I don't want to, but if we did, you can see that some lines are simply longer than others. And if you counted them out, some have 4 stresses, some have 5 stresses. Some have, for example, line 6, and drowsy with the wine dozed on one side, seems to have 5 stresses. But on the other hand, a line like the next to last one, I only knew, has 2. So, but here and there, whatever has 5 stresses finds another 5 stress line. So things are paired and not paired, just as these two people are paired physically, but there's a distance between them, emotionally, psychologically. Just seeing if there's anything I wrote down here that... Oh, also just to say that there's another good thing about the staggered rhyme, besides the fact that it can just be tedious to have very regular rhyme. That's what it does. It avoids the potential, there's a potential sing-song quality that can happen when you have very predictable rhyme, when you know exactly where to expect it. So in that sense, it's almost an argument for estrangement. This poem, I think, is better because it doesn't rhyme in a regular way. But if that's true, and if the broken rhyme equals estrangement, but if the broken rhyme is a good thing, then does that mean estrangement is a good thing? That thought just this second occurred to me, so I don't know what to make of it. But, but it's interesting, and it ties in with what Doriane said about the ending of a poem and the invisible, and then after that, everything changed. I think of that as for me, that's what resonance is for a poem, that it has ended on the page, and then we start thinking, but what? And that might drive some people crazy, but I find it pleasurable. It's what makes a poem lasting. Shall I turn to a very different poem? Let's. Francine Harris's poem. Her name is deliberately, just so you know, I'm not trying to say anything by not capitalizing her name. She doesn't capitalize it. And as you can see, she doesn't capitalize her titles either. She has an interesting relationship to capitalization, which is fine. I don't judge it. Okay, I ought to see myself as the noble rider, not the mutt, winged horse, the one whose hoof is off, the one unmade and hunched bridle, neighing backward, the cockeyed one, daydream sky of bitter apple, sucker punched, the one with a limp, unnoble mixture happened to stir, dream a weave bobber, the non-cartographer, the wet-nosed blind, the knuckled hysteric, the one knob-kneed, the one whinny, the one pulling left. Here a sister orders hissy. Some steer at my back who loves enough, but whose name I forgot. When I first read this is from her new book that came out last year called Play Dead. And you can imagine a book of poems written like this. And I just thought, no. I just didn't know what to do. But I could tell, I felt there was something there, and it made me want to get to know the language. And this book teaches you how to read the poems. In this case, first of all, the title, I ought to see myself as a noble writer. And then we go immediately to not the following things. So if we want to say, what is this all about? The basic narrative seems to be, I should see myself as X, but I don't. And that doesn't seem to me very interesting in and of itself. But I think what it's really trying to say is, I should see myself as a noble writer, but I keep trying, and I can't. And so the form allows us to watch the speaker trying to be the noble writer and failing and still trying. And to me, that gives poignancy to the poem. It starts to be more than a sort of list of seemingly nonsensical phrases sometimes, but has a kind of emotional weight to it. But looking at, first of all, some of the structure again, you can see that from the start, we have not the mutt, the one whose hoof is off, and it's as if the mode here is this person is not going to capitalize the first word of a sentence. That seems fair enough. But then she does do it at Daydream Sky, and then she does do it later at Dream a Weave Bobber. So then you think, well, maybe it's a typo. Maybe it's wrong, or maybe she doesn't know about capitalization. All these things could be the case, but it turns out I think there's a kind of system. I think starting with from that phrase, the one whose hoof is off, it's almost as if she wants to say, I'm that kind of a horse, the kind that's somewhat broken. I can't seem to fit into normalcy. And normal would be to capitalize the beginning of sentences. And I do sometimes, I try, but then I fall back on my old self and I don't capitalize. That's one reading of it. Likewise, staying with brokenness, the fact that it opens at first with fragments, and it turns out to be almost entirely of fragments. There are some sentences. One could be a sentence in stanza 2, dream a weave bobber. That could be a command, do this, dream this thing. Never mind what a weave bobber is, but dream it. but we don't know for sure. But then it seems like at first there might be a sentence that in the end, some steer at my back who loves enough, but then it turns out the steer isn't a verb, I don't think. It seems to be a steer like a cattle at my back who loves enough but whose name I forget. And then in that last sentence, I forgot. That's a complete sentence. So you could say there's a progression from fragmentation to a kind of grazing up against the completeness of a sentence to finally reaching sentencehood. In that sense, the person who tries to see herself as the noble writer or tries to be normal arrives at normalcy. But by the time we get to normalcy, we kind of know she's not going to stay there. Even the I forget or I forgot is a form of self-correction. She seems to be saying, I said I forget, but I mean to say I forgot. So it's as if she ends on the error that she has to correct. And this whole thing has maybe been stumbling through, getting it wrong, trying to get it right, going back to wrong, if wrong is not capitalizing, if wrong is to be fragmented as opposed to full sentence. This is one of those moments where I have to say, are you with me? Oh, okay. I don't never know. And I'm panicked because I've suddenly realized there are people up there. I should never have looked. I'm just looking here what I'm saying. Yeah, I guess just that it seems if we look at, there's brokenness versus wholeness at the level of sentences. There's correctness versus incorrectness at the level of capitalization. But also, what I find interesting is you've got all these, if you just look at the fragments and sentences, there are a lot of phrases that do and don't make sense, and they're broken. There's a lot of brokenness. But when you just look, without reading the poem, when you look at it, how it's laid out, it's very ordered. It's 4 stanzas of 3 lines, 4 tercets. So it looks poemy. It looks like it has order and regimentation to it. And I think that's not accidental. It's as if there's a desire to impose a sense of regularity at the level of stanza, but that is in tension with the irregularity that we've observed at all the other levels. And that tension is meaningful then because that seems to be part of what the poem is about, trying to be ordered, not being ordered, and looking ordered on the surface, but when we get inside to the guts of the poem, it turns out not to be all ordered. It's kind of random and confusing in many points. I think that's a perfect example, actually, of the appearance, the presentation that we make, but what's going on inside us as people. And the poem seems to be doing that as well. Okay, so to my shock, I guess we could look at this Louise Glick poem. It's supposed to have 2 dots over the U in her name. I just didn't know how to type that. And really, I don't know this piece as well. It's still kind of new. It's from her most recent book called Faithful and Virtuous Knight. Yeah, The Horse and Rider. But the reason I pulled this out at the last minute is because I thought that most prose poems disappoint me. And the reason they do is because they've forgotten the poem part. So they're just prose. And I think, okay, well then be prose, but don't call yourself a prose poem. Be a newspaper or something. But I think that good prose poems use elements that are used in poetry as well. So, The Horse and Rider. Once there was a rider, and on the horse, once there was a horse, and on the horse there was a rider. How handsome they looked in the autumn sunlight, approaching a strange city. People thronged the streets or called from the high windows. Old women sat among flower pots. But when you looked about for another horse or another rider, you looked in vain. My friend, said the animal, why not abandon me? Alone, you can find your way here. But to abandon you, said the other, would be to leave a part of myself behind. And how can I do that when I do not know which part you are? So, it's nice. Nice prose poem. Or maybe she thinks it's prose, but she can't help it. She becomes poetic. The main thing I want to mention is she does some things that in a typical workshop she'd be told not to do. There's a lot of unnecessary repetition. And the first one is, okay, once there was a horse, and on the horse there was a rider. Where else would a rider be but on the horse? So you might say, you know, Louise, maybe you should say once there was a horse and a rider. And maybe you shouldn't even say that, given your title. It's already been explained to us. So she could open with how handsome they looked, but we assume she has a reason for doing it this way. Then in the middle, when you looked about for another horse or another rider, now why say another twice? When you looked about for another horse or rider, you looked in vain. That would be perfectly fine, but no. Then we get this interesting structure. Said the animal, why not abandon me? Matched up against, to abandon you, said the other. And here's where we need a gigantic blackboard, but we don't have one, so I'm going to try to illustrate chiasmus to you. You know chiasmus, C-H-I-A-S-M-U-S, chiasmus, my favorite rhetorical device. And it's when you have a mirroring structure. So you could say something like, I love the dog, the cat I don't love. So you moved from I love to, okay, I love the dog, the cat I don't love. So you've got a frame of I love and I don't love, and you've got an interior frame of two nouns that happen to be animals, cat and dog. You there? Uh-huh, see? So it's kind of like if you were doing it with letters. You have A, B, B. And that framework is chiasmus. It's a mirror. You could say, if you folded it, if it were on a piece of paper and you folded it, the two verb phrases would touch each other and the two nouns would touch each other. And that happens here in this moment of, we have the bracket of said the animal, said the other. Why not abandon me? To abandon you. So that framing, you could say, well, so what? It's interesting, but what does it mean? But I find that chiasmus is most often used, well, it often is used anyway in poems to convey a kind of entrapment or sometimes a pleasurable containment because you have this double frame. And it can be very useful in showing that things are inescapable. Where you come in is where you come out again. You're still at your same phrase, or in this case, we come out with one saying this one, the other one's saying something. So we enter on speech, we pass through abandonment, and we come back out on speech. So we haven't gotten anywhere in that sense. Okay, I didn't know if I'd be able to pull that part off. So I found this interesting because it could just be something to do, but it's interesting, first of all, it's disguised because it's in prose, so we don't see it as clearly, but it says something about this horse and rider. The earlier repetitions suggest pairing. There was a horse. On the horse, there was a rider. So they're coupled. Another horse, another rider. Again, they're coupled and right next to each other. But chiasmus suggests that this is more than coupling. It's as if they are almost one and the same. They are inescapable from each other, so I would say that the chiasmus, in a way, prepares us, rhetorically, for what's said at the end. To leave you would be to leave a part of myself behind. How can I do that when I do not know which part you are? And it ends on inescapability. I can't leave you because I don't even know which part of you is me, and I can't leave me. And so they're kind of, it's more like they've entered centaurhood, if anything. Maybe it should be called the centaur. I think if I were to suggest something to her, I would say, call it that. But, and then the opening would be more surprising. But who am I to tell her? So that's all to say that those forms, those patterns or structure, all I've tried to convince you of is that how a poem is put together has a lot that it can add to what the poem is saying. And often when poems aren't getting off the page, when they don't seem to have resonance, I think the problem is, it sounds tedious, it often is something as simple as structure. But in a way, you should take heart, Because if I were to tell you whenever your poems don't succeed, it's because of a failure of vision, well, that would be horrible, because we can't just summon vision. But to say, you know, maybe it's structural, is helpful. I find it helpful, because then I realize I don't have to have vision to make my poem work. I just have to see why it's not working. And sometimes that is as simple as technique, which is trainable, even if, and learnable, even if vision is not.